Mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, for you are our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Will you please be seated? We're going to hear from Robert in a few minutes, but before I bring him forward to share, I wonder how many of you have saw that older movie. Well, it's not real old. It's only about 11 years old, 10 years old, something like that. The Matrix. Anybody here saw the movie The Matrix? Okay. I think Jason saw it. Those of you who saw it, do you remember what the last scene was in that movie? I'm sorry? No? Jason, what was it? You remember? I put you on the spot now.
The part where he flies away, or before that?
No, that's the part I was after. The part where he flies away. He's talking on a telephone, one of these old, pay telephones or something like that, and then all of a sudden he's lifted up and he flies away. And by the way, Jason, thank you for helping with your musical talents this morning. I appreciate that very much. Obvious allusion to the ascension. Now, if you never saw the movie, it's a kind of a rough movie. There's a lot of violence in that movie. But all throughout it, there were allusions to Christianity, probably some other world religions or philosophies as well mixed in there, for sure. But still, lots of Christian themes. And it ended. And when I remember seeing that, I thought, okay, there was absolutely no accident that those allusions to Christianity were in that movie. Well, last Thursday, if you had a decent calendar, last Thursday would have been showing that it was the Feast of the Ascension. And it's sad, but in much of the church life today, the Feast of the Ascension is a forgotten feast, a neglected feast. But yet it is a major feast in the calendar of the church year. You'll notice, I'm sure you'll remember that as we say the Creed every week, it's mentioned every week. We mention it. So it's a major feast because it was a major occurrence in the life of Jesus. I just want to touch very briefly on it before I give Robert again some time, because we didn't observe it last Wednesday. We had a healing service here Wednesday, and so we're going to observe it a little bit today. Historically, we do accept it as a historical fact, just the same way we accept the resurrection as a historical fact, as the virgin birth as a historical fact, and the literal fulfillment that Jesus is God incarnate as a literal fact. Luke, the author of the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, places it squarely within historical context, and Luke is a top drawer, if I can use that phrase, a top drawer historian. And so he wants us to know it exactly as it was. Back at the passage that Joe just read, he says it didn't just happen, but it happened in a particular place. It was in Bethany. Not just some obscure, nameless place, but it happened in a particular place called Bethany. He also dates it on a very particular day, 40 days in the book of Acts, early on in this passage, 40 days after Easter. That's why it always is celebrated on a Thursday. In case you ever get into a conversation at the grocery store line or at the hardware store or whatever, somebody asks you, when's the Feast of Ascension? It floats, just as Easter floats, but it's always on a Thursday. And also, he mentions the eyewitnesses in verse 9 there. And when he had said these things, as they were looking on, he was lifted up, and the cloud took him out of their sight. So he throws these things in there to show that it was a literal historical thing, not some metaphor about how he just left us some way. Also, it's right after 40 days. There's some significance in that. I'm sure you've all thought about that. 40 days parallels the beginning of his public ministry. When Jesus started his public ministry, he went out into the wilderness for 40 days, was tempted by Satan. That's the way his public ministry started. Well, this parallels that in that it ends his public ministry, his incarnate public ministry, with another 40 days where he established himself, showing himself by various proofs and signs during that 40 days, not just one or two, but many signs to the apostles that he was resurrected. He indeed came back in the flesh, and there's not a question about that. And so when Luke records this physical ascension, he meant it to be understood that way. And just as there's no question when Jesus arrived on the scene, his birth, and again the proclamation or the inauguration of his public ministry, there's no question when he leaves this earth as well. And I've already mentioned again how the Nicene Creed mentions it every week that we say it. So it is a historical fact. But what's the spiritual significance of this? It's interesting that Mark, in Mark's Gospel, when he makes reference to the ascension, he says that Jesus was taken up into heaven, and then immediately follows it, and sat down at the right hand of God. You know, when we hear that, sat down at the right hand of God, that is a place of honor. Have you ever noticed when political, governmental dignitaries will visit different countries, some come here, we go there, that if there's any kind of more or less public gathering or a state dinner or banquet or something like that, the visiting dignitary, pretty much always that I've seen, sits at the right hand of the head of state, of the one that's visiting. And you see, there was an unfortunate little bit of a faux pas, but when President Obama visited England recently, there is a video of him wanting to toast the Queen. They didn't go real well, but regardless, not well at all. Regardless, but if you saw the video, you see where he was. The Queen was immediately to his left. He was sitting to her right. That's standard protocol, and this is probably the ascension and the references to Jesus sitting at the right hand of God the Father is where a lot of that protocol comes from. So spiritually speaking, it is a place of extreme honor that Jesus sat there. But also, spiritually speaking, ascension begins, in a sense, a whole new era of God's activity in the world. While Jesus was here physically, he was limited by space and time. He couldn't be everywhere all the time. And so with his ascension, with his removal from earth, that opens the door for the coming of the Holy Spirit, which you're going to celebrate next week on Pentecost. If I don't remember to say it later on, I'll say it now. Don't forget, we wear red on Pentecost. That's a tradition. And so some of Kim's ahead of schedule a little bit. That's okay.
Come even if they don't have red.
That's right. Come even if you don't have red. That's for sure. But anyway, it inaugurates a whole new era of God's activity amongst us. And it opens the door for the Holy Spirit to be with us. But lastly, let me just share very quickly, practically. What's the significance of the ascension practically? Well, it's proof, obviously, that Jesus is no longer here, and so, but yet he gave us a commission, didn't he? Proof that it's not up to Jesus to carry on the ministry, but he left it for us. He left it to the church to carry on that ministry, to preach the gospel to all nations. After, as we heard from both the passage in Acts and the Luke passage, wait for the promise of the Father. You have to wait for that early church. In other words, you can't do it without that, but Jesus is leaving, and so that is practically meaning that we, the church in general, and ministries like Good Samaritan Orphanage in particular, are here to carry out the ministry that he's called us to. But practically it also means we need to be ready for his return. You hear the way that Acts passage ended. And while they were gazing into heaven as he went, behold, two men stood by them in white robes and said, Men of Galilee, why do you stand looking into heaven? This Jesus who was taken up from you into heaven will come in the same way as you saw him go into heaven.